My name is Mallory Ahrens. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Services here at Darien Library. It's my great honor to welcome you to our community room this evening. Thank you for joining us for week 1 of our 4-week series focusing on jazz. These are my jazz hands right over here. I'd like to remind everyone that programs at the library are made possible by contributions to the annual Friends of the Library campaign. It's because of donations that we're able to bring Gil here now a couple times a year, so thank you to everyone that has donated to the campaign thus far. Tonight's guest is a dear, dear friend to the Darien Library. How many of you have been to one of Gil's lectures here before? Great. All right, so we got a lot of friends in the house. Excellent. He's a musicologist and music theorist, has served on the faculty of SUNY Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellent Award for Distinguished Teaching, which I just love. Yeah, right? Currently, he teaches at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was recently presented with the coveted Merit Award for exemplary service to the college. I love this. This is great. At NVCC, Dr. Harel conducts the college choral, teaches music history and theory, and serves as the musical director of theater productions. Outside of teaching, he enjoys staying active as a pianist and violinist. Please join me in welcoming violinist. I'm just making things up now. Please join me in welcoming to the library, Gil.
Yeah. No, I don't play violin. Way too much going on with violin. With a piano, you sit down and you plunk a key and you get a pitch. Violin is a much more complicated animal than that in some ways. Thank you so much to Mallory for that introduction, to the library for hosting me, and of course, most of all, to everyone in this room for being here. It's freezing outside. I hate winter. Imagine many of you share that sentiment, and yet we're here because we all share something in common, which is that we are intellectually curious and we appreciate good music. And today we'll be talking about some music from a very interesting sort of cusp in history, that is to say, eras colliding and forging this new musical style, which eventually by 1916 would be called jazz. Of course, there were people playing it before that. They didn't call it jazz. It was just music to them. Good music, compelling music, captivating music. And it continues to be captivating to audiences even to this present day. I want to start with 2 anecdotes. One involves a man we're not going to be talking about until next week, but nonetheless he is one of the most celebrated figures in jazz history, certainly one of the most controversial because of the many off-color remarks he would make, the way he would antagonize his audiences. He was born in 1926. His name was Miles Davis. Miles Davis, who was infamous for playing concerts with his back to the audience, or for going up and grabbing awards and leaving immediately without so much as a thank you. Miles Davis has a great quote in his autobiography where he's talking about a trip to the Museum of Natural History in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And Miles Davis is walking with a friend, and he sees an exhibition on ancient Egypt. And there's a particular exhibit on mummies. And he points to a mummy under a glass case, and he says, "Quincy," speaking to Quincy Troop, "God help us if my music ever winds up under that glass case with that mummy over there." And I think what he was alluding to was the idea that during his own lifetime, jazz had shifted in its popularity, in its appeal to the youthful generation. And it had become something that, to Miles at least, was more likely to be found in his own imagination in a textbook than in the sort of live performances that one would have encountered in the 1940s, say, in an institution like Minton's Playhouse, the Onyx Club, the Three Deuces, or any of the other hallowed halls that heard so many of the great instrumentalists of that period, and vocalists as well, for that matter. We're going to address Miles Davis's trepidations and his concerns regarding the legacy of jazz as we might make our way through this 4-week lecture series. The other anecdote involves a very large and sometimes very angry bass player by the name of Charles Mingus. Mingus was playing in a nightclub in the 1960s, And as is wont to occur in nightclubs, people were fraternizing, socializing, drinking, carousing, otherwise making merry as they enjoyed the music, presumably, in the background. And there was apparently a particularly vociferous, particularly garrulous, particularly distracting table not far from where Mingus was playing his bass with this ensemble. And apparently there was one man who was, we might say, perhaps deep in his cups, enjoying the libation and the atmosphere that one encounters in sort of club where that music was frequently heard. And Mingus lost it. And he took a highball glass and launched it like a baseball pitcher at this particularly garrulous individual. Now, he may have been so deep in his cups, he may not have even noticed it. Well, what happened is everyone freezes and looks over at this very large, very intimidating man who was notorious for a short temper. Mingus was described by Miles Davis as a crazy, psychotic genius. Mingus has now the full attention of presumably everybody in that room, patrons and staff alike. And he looks over at this particular table that was so loud, so distracting, and any musician who's ever performed knows, anyone who's ever spoken knows, that when there's a very egregious distraction in the room, it can really throw off one's rhythm, pun intended. And Mingus uttered a very memorable line, which I think is something we should also consider as we ponder the nature of jazz, the genesis of jazz, and the legacy of jazz during this 4-week odyssey. Mingus said to him, Isaac Stern doesn't have to put up with this expletive. Isaac Stern, of course, is somebody we'd be more likely to see in Carnegie Hall. More on that particular institution in today's lecture. Playing perhaps a Brahms concerto, perhaps a double concerto for violin and cello, maybe Yo-Yo Ma seated at his side. Or we might hear Isaac Stern playing Bach's Chaconne from the unaccompanied sonatas and partitas, and this particular one in D minor, number 2. We're doing Bach in the summer, by the way, so everyone stick around. So what was Mingus getting at? Well, I think what he was referring to was the fact that as a jazz musician, he was not given the same level of respect, same level of rapt attention, the same meditative, trance-like atmosphere that one encounters in a classical concert hall where the atmosphere is akin to that which one might encounter in a sanctuary or a temple. This is a totally different atmosphere where jazz is being performed, and Mingus is clearly quite salty about it, and perhaps with good reason. One of the things I'm going to suggest throughout the duration of our 4 weeks on this topic is that classical music and jazz are really not dissimilar. And in fact, perhaps jazz should be considered a kind of classical music. In fact, there were many jazz musicians who eschewed the word jazz. Duke Ellington, famously among them, refused to use the word jazz and instead favored the term American music, because for Duke Ellington, jazz was the defining, iconic sound of America. America, of course, was a fledgling nation for the 19th century when Beethoven and Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and Mendelssohn and Wagner, when these composers were writing their great music, what was going on in America? Musically speaking, I think it's fair to say, not much. It would be unfair, and in fact, I think preposterous, to try to compare the songs of Stephen Foster to the works of the composers we just mentioned. And even if there were a great, precocious young composer, that composer would be most likely to be shipped off to Europe at a young and tender age to hone their craft in some conservatory or university type institution. A great example of that would be the composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk, by the way. a fairly obscure character in music history and usually a footnote in most music history textbooks. Gottschalk was shipped off to Paris and wound up writing music that is sort of like Chopin. If you were to dilute Chopin quite a bit, take away all the harmonic ingenuity, you get Gottschalk. So for Ellington, jazz was the defining genre of the American soundscape. Later on, in the 1970s, there would be a musician, in fact, a number of musicians, perhaps most famously Quincy Jones, who was very active in jazz as a sort of promoter, a journalism. He had a television show, and he would famously refer to jazz as black classical music. So again, there's that word classical again. The word classical, if we were to sum it up in a nutshell, my Music 101 alumni could tell you that when we use the word classical to refer to music, we're referring to a certain timeless quality. The music, like everyone in this room, gets better with age. And we know we have I think this might be, Mallory, the widest demographic spectrum ever not just in the Darien Library, perhaps at any lecture, because I'm not going to ask who the oldest person in the room is, but the youngest person in the room is sitting in that baby Bjorn over there, and it's her first lecture, and she's 8 weeks old. So, actually 2 months, yeah. And of course, we know she's soaking this all up, right? Obviously, goes without saying. So what is the legacy of jazz? What is the nature of jazz? What makes something jazzy? Who are the titans of jazz? And how can we, as listeners, distinguish between different types of jazz? Because I think it's fair to say that many listeners find jazz to be a somewhat daunting genre because there are so many types of jazz. We've got sort of the hot jazz, Dixieland from the early days. We have swing music from the 1930s, bebop, hard bop, post bop, West Coast jazz, cool jazz, modal jazz, electronic jazz, funk, Latin jazz, and of course everyone's favorite, atonal free jazz. We're going to talk about free jazz in the last week, and let me suggest that there may be some naysayers, justifiably not so enchanted with free jazz. At the present moment, you may be booting up John Coltrane's Ascensions album, or by the end of March. I think we're going to have quite a few converts to free jazz when we look at the music of Albert Ayler, John Coltrane, Archie Shepp, and others at the end of this lecture series. So many different styles of jazz. One of our primary objectives, I think, throughout this lecture series is to develop the ability to distinguish orally between different types of jazz so that we as listeners feel empowered and can say, you know what, not sure I can recognize this exact piece, not sure who the composer is, but here's what I'm hearing: polyphonic texture, simultaneous solos. I'm hearing a tuba playing a bass line. I don't really hear string bass. The drums sound very sort of basic, not a full drum set, but perhaps just a snare drum, maybe a couple of cymbals. This must be hot jazz from the 1920s, perhaps from New Orleans or Chicago. And if you were to hear sort of drone pitches sustained in the low register, emphasizing one pitch above all others, constantly circling back to that pitch while a haze of sound coalesces around that one single pitch, you might think, not sure what it is, but it sure sounds like music post-1959. This sounds, I'm hearing notes that don't sound quite major or minor, but perhaps a little bit of both. I'm hearing long, drawn-out improvisatory passages over one pitch that has absolute primacy. This must be modal jazz in the style of John Coltrane's My Favorite Things, or perhaps Miles Davis's Kind of Blue album. And we'll learn how to distinguish between the different musical attributes which typify each of these subgenres. And I think we'll find that to be an enormously satisfying experience and a very empowering one as listeners, because ultimately, when we listen to music, we want to know what we're listening to. And I think when it comes to people saying, I like this genre, I don't like that genre, I like this artist, I don't like that artist, ultimately what it comes down to a large degree, is familiarity. It's that wash of euphoria you experience when something you recognize comes on the radio. Or nowadays when you say, Alexa, play Baroque music, and you hear Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, and you say, oh, Brandenburg 2, what a weird concertino group. We got violin, we got oboe, we got recorder, we got trumpet, Baroque trumpet, fantastic. And that's such a satisfying feeling as listeners. So one of my goals as your pilot through this odyssey over the next 4 weeks is to instill in everyone in the room a sense of familiarity and a way to distinguish between different eras of jazz and even between the different stylistic tendencies of various composers. All right, let's get down to business, and not to defeat the Huns. We're just getting down to business right now. Yeah, that's a little Disney joke, yeah. What makes something jazzy? A number of features. Yeah, rhythm is a big part of it, right? If I were to play, say, Mozart, and I were to do it like this. Well, you might think, you know what, I recognize the tune, but it feels so manipulated, transformed. I did 2 things. That was Mozart in the style of Dave Brubeck. Because one thing I did was I put it in 5/4 time, very Brubeckian thing to do, and I played it with a totally different rhythm, right? I sort of swung the 8th notes so that instead of doing, I did. You might say that I made the rhythm a little bit more jagged, a little bit sort of less straightforward, more asymmetrical, some notes longer than others, and not the steady clap, clap, clap of ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-ba-bum. A very big difference. Other things that go into this cauldron of jazz ingredients. Well, a big one, which we're going to talk about today, and one we're going to revisit throughout the duration of this lecture series, is the idea of improvisation. Improvisation, a very nebulous sort of phenomenon, even to many seasoned musicians. I've played with many great musicians, and I used to play with a guy this guy could play Rachmaninoff with a blindfold on. And you'd ask him to improvise over a 12-bar blues, and he froze like a deer in the headlights. He could play arpeggios in every key at the speed of light, but he couldn't improvise over what is, for many jazz musicians, the simplest type of chord progression, the 12-bar blues. So we're going to talk about improvisation. We're going to talk about how it develops, why it's so important, and I'm going to get in a little bit to how it's done, how jazz musicians might go about improvising. There is an oft-repeated cliche that if you improvise, you should be making something up on the spur of the moment because, of course, if you practice it and you work out something in advance, well, are you really improvising anymore? Well, some say yes, some say no, but I think most seasoned musicians would say, of course, because what you're playing there, in that spontaneous moment, is always going to be different. No one musician is going to play the same lick every single time. And if you did, well, then you wouldn't be improvising. So improvisation becomes, I would say, an increasingly important part of jazz. In the early days, less so. Certainly by the 1940s, when we entered the bebop era, which we'll get to next week, it is paramount. It is 85% of what you're listening to is not written down on any page anywhere. And of course, famous improvisers from that period would include Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell. Some real interesting things to look at next week. Instrumentation is also another signature aspect of jazz, right? When we think about instruments such as the saxophone, if we were to comb through classical repertoire, we would find very little saxophone music. Maybe you would find Glazunov's saxophone concerto, not a very well-known piece, I would suggest. You might find saxophone parts in certain 20th century orchestral music, but for the most part, the saxophone is really a jazz instrument. Now, if we were to look at music from the early days of jazz, which we'll look at today, we'll find some instruments which we don't normally associate with jazz. For example, violin, banjo, even the clarinet. Clarinet, up until the 1930s, was one of the signature instruments. And in fact, if we look at the 1930s, we find names like Benny Goodman, Woody Herman, Artie Shaw, Sidney Bechet. I mean, there's a lot of really important clarinetists. And then you look at the 1940s and beyond, and the clarinet certainly sort of diminishes in its presence and therefore its importance in jazz. We're going to talk about jazz culture, which has its own idiosyncrasies and which will come up throughout the duration of this program series. I want to look at some specifics today because we're going to set an objective for ourselves. Our goal for today is to learn how to distinguish between three types of, I'm going to say jazz because the first one is really not jazz, but it is an important sort of forerunner to jazz, and that is ragtime. So we're going to start with that. Ragtime, I know there are some people who are just absolutely go bananas for ragtime, and I think part of what makes ragtime so exciting is when you play piano, you realize it's so difficult to play. It has its own unique sort of challenges, and one of which is this constant vacillation in register of the left hand. And we're going to look at a video later today where you're going to actually see how the left hand is constantly leaping, typically on eighth notes, ding bump, ding bump, ding bump, while the right hand is playing often in parallel octaves, sometimes with other notes mixed in. So say 2 or 3 notes playing at a very fast pace. Where does ragtime come from? I think to answer that question, we might go back all the way to the early 20th century. In fact, you could go back to the end of the 19th century, and certainly Scott Joplin is a name that comes to mind. Scott Joplin, sometimes thought of as the father of ragtime. He did not invent the genre, but of course he was arguably most successful as a ragtime composer. So what does ragtime have to do with jazz? Well, rhythm, primarily. The idea that rhythm should be heavily, and here's an interesting word, no, I didn't make it up, it's a real word, heavily syncopated. Syncopation, of course, refers to this idea that music is articulating the spaces between the beats. So if we were to have and those of you who recognize that rhythm, that's The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. That sort of rhythm is not something you're going to encounter in Mozart. You're not going to encounter it in Bach. You're not going to encounter it in Beethoven, not even in Brahms. And those of you who know Brahms know his rhythms can be wonderfully imaginative, very novel, but you're not going to get anything that resembles ragtime. In fact, the name ragtime is derived from the idea that the rhythms were considered so ragged or jagged that the name, of course, was derived from the rhythm. Here's an interesting piece by, of all people, Claude Debussy, who's, of course, not a ragtime composer, but a French impressionist composer whose works often conjure up a haze, a swirl, a coalescing sound of half-diminished chords and dominant ninths, evocative of an impressionist painting by Monet or Renoir, a sunrise over a lagoon, a woman standing in a sunlit field with a parasol. And yet, Debussy himself was clearly influenced by the ragtime phenomenon. Here's a piece from a collection known as Children's Corner. This one is called Golliwogg's Cakewalk. Gollywog was a type of doll from the early 20th century. To be honest, a rather racist and now controversial doll. It was a sort of a black-faced doll, you might say. And a cakewalk was a type of dance. And it was a type of dance where the winner of this sort of dance competition would be awarded a cake. And hence we have one of the most widely used idioms that I think probably somewhat opaque to many people, which is the idea to take the cake. This takes the cake. This is the best. The winner of the cakewalk dance would take the cake. So here is Debussy's Golliwogg's Cakewalk, and you can actually see in the top line, we have this da-dum, ba-dim, bum, be-da-ba-dum, ba-da-ba-bum, ba-da-ba-bim, bum. So we'll go ahead and listen to that. And we go into 6 flats next for the somewhat slower section. This is a great piece. For those who know it, Debussy in the middle section is going to satirically mock the music of, anyone know who he quotes there? He quotes Richard Wagner. And he quotes the melody from Tristan and Isolde, the sort of the love theme from Tristan and Isolde, this one. What Wagner does. And what Debussy does is he sets up the same thing, and then he immediately goes back to the cakewalk to trivialize the heaviness of Wagner's leitmotifs from Tristan. And he's going to mock another leitmotif from the same opera. That's Isolde's famous aria from the end of the opera, the Liebestod, the famous Love's Death, which Debussy turns into a preposterous cakewalk here. So we see the rhythms. Beat up, ba beat up, ba-dum, bum, beat up, ba-dum, bum. We see the left hand jumping registers constantly. Well, Joplin would take this idea and he would really use, for the most part, what are fundamentally sort of Western European harmonies. There's nothing in the harmony in ragtime, typically, which smacks of jazz. Sometimes when people think of jazz harmony, they think of chords like the flat 9, dominant flat 9. Or maybe a minor 9th chord. Right? These are sort of traditional jazz harmonies, major 7. Minor 7 add 9, or chords that defy labeling. And so we simply call it the so what chord. So what if we don't have a name for it? We'll just call it the so what chord after the track. There's nothing in ragtime which really smacks of jazz in terms of the harmony. The harmony is something that you might find in the works of Mozart, Beethoven, Mendelssohn. It's sort of somewhere between classical and early romantic. So therefore, it's fairly straightforward. And for the time period, that is to say late 19th century or early 20th century, it's fairly ho-hum. So harmony is not really what drives ragtime. It's rhythm. It's rhythm, it's the syncopation, it's the chromaticism in the melody. The melody often passes through tones which are not active chord tones. Let's go ahead and listen to one of the most famous rags by Scott Joplin. Here's The Entertainer. Joplin, by the way, it's sometimes imagined that these composers sort of lived in their own world and they wrote music within the microcosmic bubble of the particular idiom that they champion. And that's simply not the case. As we'll see throughout this unit, these composers, many of them, were incredibly well-read. They were well-versed in other styles of music. Joplin, for example, was well-versed in Romantic European piano literature, Chopin, Liszt, that sort of thing. And it's therefore not surprising to find out that that's going to carry through the whole, I think, history of jazz. Many of these composers were steeped in Western European harmony. Let me give you one other example. Charlie Parker, who's sometimes derisively dismissed as a heroin addict of the bebop era, who simply played what Louis Armstrong called Chinese music. He was referring to bebop, which was so incoherent to Louis Armstrong that he called it Chinese music. But Charlie Parker was also a student of Western European harmony. And some of you may know he recorded with a string quartet in the early 1950s at the end of his life. Charlie Parker famously walked around with Stravinsky scores in his back pocket. So there is a connection between the so-called classical world. Some of you know I don't love that word because it's used too broadly. But there is this connection between traditional classical composers and the jazz world. Here is Scott Joplin's The Entertainer. And again, you'll be able to see the score here. You'll notice it is also syncopated. Beep ba bum ba bum, beep ba bum ba bum. Not rhythms you're going to encounter in traditional Western European classical music. So this music really functions, this particular piece does, and many of these rags function as sort of almost like a classical rondo functions. A classical rondo gives you an A section, B section, section C, D, back to A, B, back to A, C. think of Mozart's Rondo alla Turk, which is where we started at the piano, right? Although we did the Dave Brubeck version in 5/4, it has a similar harmonic structure, not dissimilar from Western classical music. And again, I think the fundamentally simple nature of the harmony is apparent to most listeners. Yes, there's some interesting chromaticism in the left hand as the bass line descends stepwise to give us a powerful arrival on the dominant chord, which is going to lead to that resolution, just as you would get in Mozart. We have these parallel phrases, right, just as you would have in Mozart, where you introduce a theme, dee-da-dee-dum, da-dum, da-dum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-dum, ba-dum-dum, da-da-dee-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, consequent ba-da-ba-dee-ba-da-bum, ba-da-ba-bum, dee-da-dee-bum, ba-dim, ba-dum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-dum, ba-dum-dum. And then we end with the last one. So very similar stylistically in terms of the harmonies, the chords, to Western classical music, but rhythmically very different. There's one thing missing in ragtime which disqualifies it really from being considered true jazz. And that would be improvisation. Ragtime is devoid, bereft of improvisation. There is no improv in ragtime. You play what's on the page. Now, what's on the page may be very sort of technically demanding, and it may have this sort of fun, lighthearted quality much of the time. Not all rags are in major keys, but many are. However, if you're playing what's on the page and you're not improvising, then it's not jazz. There's more improvisation playing a Bach partita than there would be in a rag piece. That's not a knock against ragtime. It's simply putting the music, we're putting the music into categories, we're checking off boxes. Remember, our goal is to determine what we're listening to. So if we were to hear ragtime, I think most of us would be very comfortable identifying it as ragtime. We would hear a left hand which is bouncing around from low note in the deep register of the piano, leaping up to grab a chord, constantly vacillating between registers. We would hear a heavily syncopated right hand, often articulating parallel octaves. And we would hear these neatly balanced, very elegant antecedent and consequent phrases, often 16 bars long. And those are the things to listen for when we listen for ragtime. Scott Joplin would die in 1917, not before composing many works, including an opera, Tremonisha, which was a Jeopardy clue a couple of months ago. For those who watch Jeopardy, it came up on a Jeopardy clue perhaps, 6 weeks ago. And I remember it because I was sort of half paying attention, and the word opera came up in the clue, and Amy shot me a look, and she said, "Honey?" And it took me about a second. I looked up, I saw opera and Tremonisha, and immediately said, "Who is Scott Joplin?" And of course, none of the contestants got it, because it's fairly arcane stuff. People would know the Maple Leaf Rag, they would know the Entertainer, but knowing Tremonisha, that's going to be at the bottom clue in the category, right? So it's always very satisfying, for those who watch Jeopardy, very satisfying to get it right when the other contestants have no clue. Then again, me watching a category on music on Jeopardy is like Amy watching a category on orthodontics. I haven't seen a category in orthodontia yet, but it's going to happen one day, sweetheart. It's one day. All right, I want to talk about our next composer. We could spend a lot of time, and let me just suggest, as I often do, you've heard me say this many times, it would be impossible to do justice to any one composer, certainly any one broad genre, by spending 4 meager hours talking about this music. There's a whole lot to say, and we could certainly spend 4 whole lectures talking about Louis Armstrong. Let's start with the name. Louis or Louis? After all, he grew up in the New Orleans area, and therefore there should be a sort of French quality there, right? That should be pronounced Louis. It reminds me of a student who, when talking about Baroque music, when asked to name an example of Baroque architecture, raised his hand confidently and said, "Oh, I know, the Palace of Versailles." And I said, "Very good. Do you know who lived in the Palace of Versailles?" And he looked at me and he said, "Sure, that's easy. It was King Louis." Well, it's very tempting to say Louis Armstrong, and most people do. However, it seems to have been the case that Louis Armstrong, for those who know about him, know that he was such an affable person. Perhaps his most defining trait beyond his musicality and his intense musical improvisatory genius was this easygoing personality, the personality of a consummate entertainer, one who knows how to enchant an audience both with his playing as well as with charismatic banter. She was very well known for. So he was addressed by both Louis and Louis, and it seems he bothered to correct absolutely nobody when either name was spoken aloud. However, on a recording of the song Hello Dolly, he says, "Hello Dolly, this is Louis." So most musicologists and most people who study this era and this type of music will say Louis Armstrong, simply because it seems to have been the composer, his own preference. So let's talk a little bit about this style of jazz. We have really 3 or 4 different names for this period of jazz. Some call it New Orleans jazz, some call it hot jazz, some call it Dixieland. Think any of the above are perfectly fine. But we want to know, what does it sound like? So let me say a little bit about where this music comes from, and then I'll talk about what it sounds like. And we'll listen to 2 examples, I think both of which are sort of paradigmatic examples from which we can really gain a solid footing as listeners. So first of all, we mentioned New Orleans. New Orleans makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because it is this crossroads, this place where various cultures are converging. We have a white European element, we have a black African American element, we have sort of island elements, Creole elements, all of which is mixing in the very unique culture of New Orleans. Those of you who know about New Orleans, you know that this is going to sound somewhat morbid when we start, but you'll see where I'm going with this. This is sort of the point, is that because of the water table in New Orleans, traditional burial in a traditional cemetery didn't take place. And so when someone died, it would be very often the case that the body would be carried through the streets off to a final resting place that would be some distance from the main living quarters of the citizens of New Orleans. And as they marched through the streets, even during funerals, I should say, especially during funerals, it was not atypical for music, and somewhat unusually, perhaps paradoxically, somewhat joyful music, to accompany the party as they made their way through the streets. Not the sort of black-clad, grieving, lamentative mourners that we imagine at a traditional funeral, but rather something very different, antithetical in some ways, a celebration of life as the mourners meditate on death. So this idea of sort of raucous music making out in the streets is woven into the fabric of New Orleans culture. And we talked about all of those elements, those cultural elements that are melding together. And some of the great musicians of this period were from New Orleans. I'm going to just talk about Louis Armstrong, although we could easily talk about Buddy Bolden or King Oliver and many others. What made Louis Armstrong such a powerful and, I'll just say it, I don't like to use this word very often, but I'll say it because I think it's warranted in such a way. Such a genius musical figure was his sense of improvisatory creativity. His ability to create music on the spur of the moment and to imbue those improvised passages with such personality, with contour, with dimension, and with all these other abstract things that musicians love to talk about, right? What makes a solo a good solo? He was adopted unofficially at a young age by a Jewish family in New Orleans, the Karnofsky family. And to the end of his days, he wore a Star of David pendant under his shirt in thanks to the Karnofsky family, which he himself was an orphan. So therefore, this was his adopted family. He showed tremendous talent even as a youth, playing not the trumpet, although that's what people associate him with, but rather the cornet, which is a similar instrument to the trumpet. It had traditionally been associated more with military music and therefore with big brass bands from that period. What kind of music were they playing in that period? Well, in 19-teens and 1920s, type of music you would encounter in hot jazz, what I'll call Dixieland-style jazz, or sometimes it's called traditional jazz, is marked by a few features. Number one, collective improvisation. People playing solos, improvising solos at the same time. Now you might think, boy, improvising solos at the same time, that sounds positively chaotic. And to some degree, it is, as all polyphonic music is going to polarize audiences because it's going to overwhelm you. Remember, polyphonic means you have simultaneously independent things happening the way you would encounter in, say, a fugue by, well, it just so happens we're going to be studying him in the summer, Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach's critics had plenty to say about his polyphonic music. One critic, Scheibe, wrote, Herr Bach writes great stuff. Really, Herr Bach is terrific. But Herr Bach just ruins his music by writing too many notes, too much going on, it's too much at the same time. Give us a melody, give us a basic harmony, and get us out of here. Of course, that wasn't the case then, and certainly not the case here. Here, polyphony is the dominant texture. Let's go ahead and listen to what that might sound like. You're going to hear clarinet and trumpet most obviously, I think, are most present. But also I want you to listen to the bass line. We tend to associate jazz with having someone playing a string bass, an upright string bass, plucking pizzicato, right? Like the guy in the Foxwoods commercials from years ago. However, back then, string bass was not the norm. Not until the mid-20s in Chicago, when recording technology could pick up that pizzicato sound, which is a sort of a much more delicate sound in many ways than what you're going to hear in this video. So here is Louis Armstrong and his Hot Seven, which was a group he recorded with in Chicago in the late 20s. I believe this is 1927 or so. How many people found call it the dialogue between the trumpet and the clarinet somewhat distracting? I think many listeners might have that experience. It's not the most melodic kind of music, this style of jazz. Much of it is vocal, and so therefore you will have sections where melody predominates. However, in this opening minute or so that we listened to, there is this sort of chaos that comes about when you have two instruments improvising simultaneously. And of course, because they're improvising, they can't anticipate what the other is going to play. Let me suggest that the next time that we encounter simultaneous improvisation will probably be when we get to the free jazz period and we talk about collective improvisation, the music of Charles Mingus and John Coltrane. Coltrane took collective improvisation to such an extreme level that he basically put everyone in his studio together and said, all right, fellas, anybody can play anything they want at any time, no chords, don't worry about notes. It's not about notes. We're beyond notes. Notes are some 1950s. We don't need notes anymore. It's about feeling, it's about sound color, it's about tone, it's not about notes. Everybody play. And then you get albums like the Ohm album, which maybe I'll play at the end of our session today to give you a sense of where we're headed at the end of our fourth week together. Let's go over to a video from the 1960s, I believe. Of course, Louis Armstrong died in 1971 in Corona, Queens, of all places. Anybody ever been to Corona? That's where the Lemon Ice King is, right? Actually, that's where we got engaged in Corona, in Flushing Meadow Park. So Corona, great place. Yeah, nothing but good things to say about Corona. There's a great quote about Louis Armstrong from Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington said, "He was born poor, died rich, never hurt anybody along the way." And of course, once again, referring to this gentle, affable demeanor that Armstrong possessed in spades. But it wasn't without controversy. Because he was such a consummate performer, because he was such a charismatic presence when entertaining audiences, he was accused by some, most notably Miles Davis and others, of being a sort of a grinning fool, to use the exact phrase that Miles Davis uses in his book. A grinning fool. Davis goes so far as to suggest that Louis Armstrong was a sort of Uncle Tom, a very pejorative term indicating that Armstrong was some sort of betrayer of racial allegiance, somebody who was excessively servile and sort of pleading with his white audience. And of course, Armstrong, I think, would have said that he was a non-confrontational person. He had some interesting personality quirks, one of which was that he was an enthusiastic user of laxatives. And in fact, he would go around at parties and hand out laxative packets to people and invite them to try it. This strange idiosyncratic behavior of Armstrong. But again, that's about the most controversial thing I can think of when it comes to his personality. He was a man who clearly delighted in entertaining audiences. He clearly enjoyed interacting with audiences, and you'll see that come through in this video. Now, even though this video is far beyond the Dixieland era of the 1920s, obviously somebody who's attained a level of success and familiarity on a national and even international scale as Louis Armstrong is going to be playing this music well into his later years. And at this point, of course, he's in his 60s. Armstrong maintained throughout his life that he was born on July 4th, 1900. That's a nice time to be born, isn't it? July 4th, 1900. Well, it turns out a musicologist in the 1970s discovered through the baptismal records that, in fact, he was not born. He was actually born in August of 1901. But July 4th, 1900 sounds pretty good. Here's a famous tune. I think you'll all know it, When the Saints Go Marching In. And here we'll also see collective improvisation between clarinet, trombone, and trumpet. We'll see that the instrument that we heard on the bass line in the previous video, which was, believe it or not, a tuba. That's right. In Dixieland jazz, you're more likely to hear a tuba or maybe even a sousaphone playing the bass line. Because remember, a lot of this music grew out of those marching bands and those sort of military bands. So it hadn't been refined yet. Here's When the Saints Go Marching In with a more traditional lineup. Armstrong, of course, in addition to being a celebrated cornetist and trumpeter, is also a fabled vocalist. And I think most people would say perhaps not the prettiest voice. I don't know that I'd want him in a Renaissance madrigal ensemble. I don't think his voice would blend very well. But as a soloist in this style, a very memorable and very iconic sound. His voice has sometimes been described as gravelly. You know that sound when you're driving in a gravel driveway? It has that sort of crunchy sound. Anyway, you can see the smile on the face. You can see the enthusiasm in engaging the audience. Clearly, this is somebody who enjoyed being a performer. And comparing him to Miles Davis is not really fair. We're talking about a full generation's difference. Someone born in 1901 versus 1926. Miles Davis had no problem turning his back on an audience if they weren't showing the respect he felt he was due. Charles Mingus had no problem throwing a highball glass at a rowdy patron. It's hard to imagine Louis Armstrong doing either of those things under any circumstances. Simply was not in his personality to do so. So if you were asked, what does hot jazz sound like? What does Dixieland music sound like? You would say, well, first and foremost, the ensemble is different than what you might conjure up when imagining a jazz ensemble. You're going to have maybe tuba or even sousaphone sort of pumping out those bass notes. Remember, in the early days, and I mean the really early days of sound recording, you needed an instrument that those early microphones could pick up, and so those brass instruments were useful in that way. By the 1920s, technology had evolved somewhat, and you could mic very closely to the bass player to pick up the sound of a bass being played pizzicato, meaning not bowed, but rather plucked. Pizzicato is one of those words that you might say is an example of onomatopoeia, right? It sort of sounds like what it means. Pizzicato means to pluck. What else marks this style? What else typifies the Dixieland sound? Well, perhaps most egregiously, the most obvious thing, the most present thing in the sound is the sound of collective improvisation. And typically that's going to involve clarinet, trumpet, and maybe one other instrument, all happening at the same time, giving us a very dense, very layered, and to some ears, a somewhat chaotic sound. I think it's fair to say that many listeners will find Dixieland jazz to be very, to use a word that sometimes comes up in the music business, very busy, right? There's a lot going on. They're going to simplify that in the next era, and we'll talk about it quickly today. We won't have time to finish it, so we'll finish it next week. But I'm going to talk about the swing era. Swing era mostly corresponds to the 1930s. And of course, there's many aspects of what sort of qualifies as swing. What is swing music? First and foremost, we should say that swing is something that transcends music. It is a physical dance phenomenon as well. And in the 1930s, imagine a dance hall with a swing, not a band, but an orchestra, whose ensembles were known primarily as orchestras, Benny Goodman and his orchestra, right? Glenn Miller's orchestra, more likely to encounter the word orchestra than band in this period. They swell in size. They go from 5 people or 7 people up to 18 perhaps, or maybe even more. And the music was danced to. And it would be danced to in a way which was somewhat controversial among the older generation from that period. Well, this seems to be a recurring theme in music history, right? In the 1960s, those kids, they're listening to this corruptive music. It's going to erode their morality. It's going to lure them into carnal, sinful, lascivious thoughts. It's no good. Nicht gut. Well, in the 1930s, it turns out that that attitude prevailed among the older generation as well. After all, people dancing, sweating, twisting, twirling, grabbing each other in close quarters is considered very risque in that period. And swing music was therefore associated primarily with youth. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because jazz, as it evolved, had less and less of a grasp on youth. You might say that the apex of its grasp on youth was in the 1930s. The apogee of its popularity happened during the swing era. That's going to change. I'll say a few more things about swing before we end today's program. By the 1930s, jazz, through swing to some degree, had become not just a national phenomenon, but an international phenomenon, and had become exceptionally popular in Europe. Now, that would intensify after 1941, because after December 7th, 1941, when troops are deployed both to the Pacific and to the European theaters of war, there's going to be bands along the way, and they're going to be playing this incredibly popular style of dance music. Remember, this is dance music which instills a sense of euphoria in the dancers as they move, twirl, tap, and so on. The bands are playing music which is, you might say, a little bit cleaner in some ways than Dixieland music is. It's more based on a homophonic texture with a very clear-cut melody, played typically by a section in what is known not as a solo, but as a soli. You're going to have long stretches of improvisation, but with the rest of the ensemble playing very specific, written-out backing, what are sometimes called hits. You're going to have the standardization of the rhythm section, typically involving a piano or guitar with upright bass and a full drum set in this period. This is really a very important period, the rise of many famous drummers and pianists in the 1930s. Those two instruments, which don't really feature very prominently in Dixieland, right? When we talk about Dixieland and we talk about this period, we talk about Buddy Bolden, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Bix Beiderbecke, Paul Whiteman. We don't talk about pianists in this period too much. That's going to change as we get into the 30s. Pianists and drummers become incredibly important. People like Earl Hines, for example, and of course, Gene Krupa. There's many names we're going to talk about next week. As jazz exploded in popularity, And as swing music dominated the dance halls, and it became popular not just in America but abroad, it really puts America on the map as sort of an originator of a musical style which spreads and catches fire abroad. And that's really interesting. That makes jazz a very unique genre of American music, because all the music from the 19th century, that music never became popular abroad. The music of Stephen Foster, for example. Why listen to Stephen Foster when Johannes Brahms is writing Lieder at the same time? Why would Europeans gravitate towards that style of music? And we talked about how American musicians, if they showed promise, if they were precocious at a young age, often went to study the European model. Here in the 1930s and 40s, you've got Europeans studying the American model. And that makes jazz unbelievably important, I think, as an American genre of music. And this is perhaps why Duke Ellington was so adamant about calling this style American music rather than jazz. Let me show you one rather nefarious poster from the late 1930s. Here is a poster from Nazi Germany, from the Third Reich, and it says Entartete Musik, which means degenerate music. Not everybody had a favorable reaction to the explosion in popularity of jazz. And I'm going to end with a somewhat humorous story. There aren't many humorous stories involving the Third Reich, but I think this one might qualify. The Nazis went to great lengths to ban jazz. And as you can see from this poster, they associated jazz with two hated groups of Untermenschen, of subhumans, blacks and Jews. Because, of course, many of the great musicians from this period were black or Jewish. Louis Armstrong is sort of a great convergence of those two things, having been a black man adopted by a Jewish family. But I mentioned Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, whose name I think was something like Shefkowitz or something. It wasn't Artie Shaw. Woody Herman. There were many prominent Jewish jazz musicians as well. So for the Nazis, this was a hated genre to be banned. It was verboten, forbidden. And you could be beaten by, if it were before let's say before 1939, even then you had sort of morality police whose job it was to sort of spy on youth and go around and see what are they listening to. And if they're listening to jazz, they could be castigated very, very severely in draconian manner, typical of the Nazis. And yet, jazz steadily became more and more popular in Germany under the Third Reich. So much so that by 1941, the Nazis had no clue what to do about the popularity of jazz, and they decided that if you can't beat them, join them. And thus was born the official Third Reich Nazi propaganda jazz ensemble known as Charlie und sein Orchester, or in English, Charlie and his Orchestra, playing rip-offs of American hits contrafacted to fit with German lyrics glorifying the Third Reich and the fatherland. Most of those songs, by the way, written by blacks or Jews. So as we head into next week's program and we wrap up the swing era and get into the bebop era, I think it's a great way to take in just how far we've come in a mere 2 or 3 decades, going from this kernel of an idea in New Orleans to being an international phenomenon, a distinctly American genre of music, and one which I think had many Americans beaming with pride. We'll talk about that next week when we discuss swing and bebop. And I'll see everybody then. Thank you so much for coming, folks.